Hi everyone, I want to welcome you to the first session of today, session 3C FDO application number 2. I'm really glad to see your faces in person, and also I want to welcome everybody who joined online to our session. And we will start. I have a small remark for the speakers. Please be on time of 10 to 12 minutes for the talk, and consider 2 to 3 minutes questions answering question. And I will also moderate the online chat. So if you are having any question, feel free to share it with us. I will raise the question in the session. And for the attendees here, if you have question, please raise and attend the microphone in the middle of the room so that people online can also hear and will be recorded. And with that, we can actually start. I invite Sharif Islam to come and start the first talk, please.
Thank you, Amirpasha. Yes, good morning. Welcome to our first session. And my name is Sharif. I'm a data architect at Naturalis here, and also welcome to Leiden. And with me, my co-presenters are also here, Andreas Weber and Erzsébet Tóth-Czifra, and they will also talk with me here. So we'll do some sort of tag teaming. We'll see how it works. So primarily what I'm interested to talk about today is this idea of European common data space. You've seen a few articles probably from the European Union and a few other organizations. So we've been trying to figure out what that actually means, what are the implementation challenges, and of course how the whole idea of fair digital objects that we're talking about here today ties into the whole data common space or common data space. And the reason we have sort of the Green Deal to cultural heritage, which will make sense in a minute, is sort of the idea, this common, this whole thing that goes from agriculture, from health. Even though cultural heritage is not there, there's a new announcement that came later that we'll talk about that also brings in the cultural heritage sector is there. So as you can see, it's a wide range of things, and of course one of the interesting thing that mentions in these documents is this idea of reuse and access, and of course FAIR is prominent in that. And EOSC, the European Open Science Clouds, is also interested in this kind of services that provides wider access and a common space. So that got us thinking that how do we actually, make sense of this space, and can the FDO specification at least provide some guidance? It's not an implementation, it's not infrastructure, but at least it can provide some guidance to think about what do we mean by common space, where we have to accommodate all of these things and maybe more. So I'm involved in the project called Disco. So we are also been thinking about like where is this data space? I mean, how do we find it, or how do we build it? So Disco is coming from the natural science collection, so museum like Naturalis and botanical gardens and our other collection institutes, so providing a data service and research infrastructure. So we're still in our preparation phase. But we're working with a lot of collections and also users of those collections to see how the data that derive from those specimens can be used for scientists. And in our collaboration, we also realized that multidisciplinarity is a very important aspect. So we have historians and from people from other disciplines, cultural history, cultural heritage, also interested in these collections. And on the other side, we have Daria, which is also an Eric. They work with the arts and humanities and also the cultural heritage space. So they also have researchers and scientists doing lots of interesting things with data and of course with the physical objects. So we started sort of informally trying to figure out what are the commonalities. And then we started reaching out to Europeana. Europeana is a data aggregator for some of this cultural heritage data, and also Naturalis also has a lot of herbarium images in Europeana. And then we also found out some connections with this another institution called Archives Portal Europe. They also have a lot of historical records, manuscripts, maps, personal history. So we did some small scale, experimentation to see where some of this data are there. And of course, one of the primary thing that we discuss is about persistent identifiers and links. We talked about that yesterday during the working session as well. How do we link these things? When an entity or a specimen or something's mentioned in one archive, can we find the related things in the other archive? So those are some of the, basic things we're looking into. But you can imagine that if we try to build a common data space with all of these entities and actors, it's going to be a huge challenge. So one way we're trying to resolve it is to actually talk with researchers and real people. And we actually have somebody here with us, and Andreas will be briefly walking you through some of the data challenges that is there, and hopefully that will show you the complexity of this common data space. Andreas.
Thanks a lot, Sharif. So let's say you're a researcher, I'm a historian of science. If you want to know more about this very specific specimen, it's a Tomistoma schlegeli, which is now stored at the depot archives of the depot of Naturalis. Then you would look at the label. First of all, you would find a name, Salomon Müller, which apparently was the collector. And then you could go to a website called Binomia, which aggregates Wikidata, and you would find out that Salomon Müller, the collector of this specimen, collected with other people, Heinrich Boye, Christian Mecklot, Peter Korthaus, and others. And we started to build, to kind of aggregate this kind of data stories also in a Jupyter notebook, so you find a link below. So if you put that a bit more simplified, then you have indeed this collector, Salomon Müller, you have the specimen, and you find co-collectors. And if you do a little bit of an extra effort, you would also find a map, or you would find a geographical location where the specimen was collected. Here's a map of Borneo, and this very specific specimen was collected 500 kilometers north of Banjarmasin, back then kind of colonial area of the Dutch Netherlands Indies. Kind of expedition was going on in that direction. So that is a bit how far the digital space would bring you if you're interested in kind of historical context and also how things are linked. But there's a huge world underneath that is not grasped by this digital space. And I know that because I'm doing since 10 years research into this collection. So to give you a bit of a glimpse. So I edited a diary of one of these collectors, 1,000 pages, handwritten pages. And if you do that, then you will see that it was a major infrastructure endeavor to get this specimen collected. You find hundreds of thousands of unnamed helpers involved in such an expedition. And you would find a lot of additional visual evidence, which I just kind of copied in here on this slide, which is not grasped by the digital data space as it is now, since we have a relatively strict division between cultural heritage and natural heritage. So bridging that, building bridges would be really nice. So to give you a bit of numbers, so for instance in this diary you have 500 person names, almost 2,000 place names, and around 1,000 plant and animal names, local names, also Latin scientific names. But most of that information, I guess more than 90%, you will not find in a digital space as it is now. So there's enormous richness underneath, and the challenges are linking that, making it discoverable, and also kind of binding this heterogeneous data together to get good contextualization of this very important and really valuable cultural heritage. Erzsébet.
So, as you sorry, it always happens like. Good morning, everyone. So, thanks a lot for this very illustrative example, Andreas. And so, this is one of the takeaways for us at Daria, that our dependence on third-party data, heritage data in this respect, is not only our problem, and by us I mean arts and humanities scholars. Heritage data, and this is why we decided to cross then a cultural adjective, because natural heritage is also part of it in many other types of heritage data. It's a problem of paleontologists, natural scientists, arts, humanities people. Our data workflows are essentially dependent on the availability of digitized or born digital heritage data. So, yes, sorry, forwards. So, with that in mind, you can imagine such research workflows from the many disciplines for whom it's relevant as something essentially overarching different sectors. The cultural heritage sector or heritage sector, where we are working with libraries, archives, galleries, museums, and the research data sector. So for the latter, of course, as everybody knows, we have this mega infrastructure, what we call the European Open Science Cloud. So we have the EOSC for research data on the one hand, and we have the European cultural heritage data space to be. On the other hand, the question we need to ask from ourselves is how not to reproduce the same silos, one for heritage, one for research, that seriously affects fair data workflows in such research domains. This is only one of the many questions we need to ask from ourselves in order to wisely shape the alignment between the two and shape the European cultural heritage data space itself. So at this point, I give back the floor to Sharif, who is going to take you to further such questions.
Thank you. So I hope you got an idea, of different types of data and linking we're thinking about, and a few other people are also been talking about this. So what I'm going to talk now to finish this presentation is I mostly borrowed from this blog post from Paul Keller. So he identified 5 big things to kind of break down what actually we can do with this common data space. So the first one is admitting that it's a really hard problem. I mean, building something like this is not easy. So there's a lot about commitment, data space, data stewardship, and each organization have to kind of think a little bit beyond their domain or their responsibility. So there I think FDO Forum and the whole FDO can help to bring together as a community to think about and space which is not a organization or institute. So as you can see, we have the specimen, we have the images, we have the publications, we have all the peoples and collectors. At the moment, yeah, there are links in between, but the curation and the things that happening are in a very organizational specific environment. So I would suggest you to quickly go and read that blog post. Is really insightful. Another thing he talks about is this, that these common space has to be non-extractive. Of course, the idea of commons is not new. Before the idea of market and private property came along, long time ago we had these commons. Not just in the European context, in other parts of the world as well. So that's not a new idea. So the idea is that you build something that makes it bigger than the sum of the individuals. And when you start looking into how we are constructing FDO, we have different elements, operations, identifiers, metadata. We're putting things together, little elements, and we're trying to make something that's bigger than all those individuals. So I think I found some really nice parallels to this idea of the commons and the way we're thinking about FDOs and fair digital objects. Again, these stewardships and responsibility has to be multi-nested. We cannot rely on Disco or Daria or Europeana or Archives Portal to sort of connect all these things. Of course, everybody has responsibilities. However, these stewardship needs to be shared and have some interaction. And at the end, most importantly, these data spaces should not be seen in isolation. If you look at even one object and one data model, you see that the specimen has collections with a publication has collections with maps, and we're doing also similar things in the other domain with Elixir, with genomics and other scientific data as well. So all of these things are connected, but however, when we try to think of as a FDO abstraction or encapsulation, we have the opportunity to bring them together. Of course, a lot of these data are coming from different domains, they have their expertise. However, this encapsulation of FDO can help us to think about this common data space in a much more integrated way. Thank you for attention. I also want to mention that some of our other contributors that helped. And yeah, we have links in the presentation. You can find out more about some of the earlier works we did with this collaboration. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. Floor is open for any question. If you have any question, please come forward. Anybody on the floor? Okay. So I guess we can skip already to the next. Yeah, please.
Hi, Sharif. Matt from DataCite. I've lost some hair since we last saw each other. Interested in, and obviously, you know, a lot of this is we're talking about technology, but I often talk about technology and engagement, and it's really nice to see you talking about working with researchers and having researchers as part of this. Kind of interested in how you see that adoption working across domains, across borders. Maybe just a little insight into some of my thinking is that people, even within the same domain, in different regions will do different things. And so we need technology to support that, but we also need to show tangible benefits to the researchers, to the community to do that. And so I don't know, I mean, I know we kind of sort of walking on this path together, but just interested in any insight in kind of the direction that you see that going and how to get that adoption sort of moving and getting that traction going.
Yeah, that's a very important point. So yeah, as you all know, we're doing a lot of things with persistent identifiers, and so I think one way we've found it that useful is that, you know, we want to present the big ideas, but then, you know, break it down with very specific things. So I think working with persistent identifiers and Jupyter Notebook, we found it very useful to demonstrate some of this idea. So we can show that, hey, if you have a persistent identifier with the specimen and I have a persistent identifier with my publication and map, I can actually very easily connect things. And not only connect things, I can actually persistently refer to things, you know, in our publication, in other workflow. And that is very concrete for a researcher to show these things. So I think we are making some progress to sort of identifying those small things, you know, and then showing the importance of those to the researchers that, okay, if you have these things, you can cite them, and then you can reuse them. And then take that to the next level, to the organization and the stakeholders that, you know, these identifiers are not magic. There's infrastructure behind it. There's actually, you know, somebody has to maintain those things. Those strings does not just come out of nowhere. So that needs support from you know, different stakeholders and organizations. So I think those little steps, I think it's important to sort of think about, and that's why I think our collaboration with Andreas was helpful, because we could actually see what type of data he needs, what type of links he needs, where are the gaps, and things like that. Yeah, thank you.
And then I'll sort of just make a comment on that. I think also doing the top-down as well, getting the funders, policymakers to incentivize it, and also because, you know, I look at data citation, there's no real incentive to cite data at the moment necessarily. I mean, there's the Nelson memo that's come out that's starting to, and there's, you know, different policymakers starting to encourage data citation as an example, but there's no real incentive. If I'm a researcher to really cite my data or link it, there's no incentive. And so I think if we can make it easy, make it possible from an infrastructure technology perspective, workflows showing those benefits of links, as you say, get the policymakers to actually incentivize it, not just through policy with big stick, but actually incentivize it and recognize it in research assessment workflows. You know, I think that helps us move forwards.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With this, I want to invite our next speaker, Marisa Conte from University of Michigan, and she will talk about computable phenotype for cohort identification. Please.
That second one, yes, number 2, thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Marisa Conte. I'm from the medical school at the University of Michigan. After 15 years as an academic health sciences library, I've recently transitioned to being a research specialist in the Department of Learning Health Sciences, so a very different type of knowledge management.
And with that, I'm happy to share today some initial work that we're doing to explore computable phenotypes as a type of computable biomedical knowledge that can be packaged as knowledge objects and hopefully as fair digital objects. I'd like to begin by acknowledging our research team, the Knowledge Grid team. The names listed here, those in bold, were of particular help as I put this presentation together today. Also acknowledging funding from my Department of Learning Health Sciences at the University of Michigan Medical School. So this image should look familiar. What I've done is just overlay the model of a fair digital object with what we're doing with our knowledge objects for computable biomedical knowledge. So we have a bit sequence at the center, which is the computable knowledge content. Our lab for the last 5 to 6 years has been working to package primarily risk models or prediction models, occasionally treatment selection for clinical decision support, and we're moving now to computable phenotypes, which will represent a bit of a change in how we package these knowledge objects. In addition to the bit sequence itself, we also have a deployment description, which is basically the runtime specification for the object. Our previous knowledge objects have also been linked to a service description, which calls an open API. We found that this isn't working particularly well for the computable phenotypes, so we're going to be looking for a different model for that. We have metadata records included in the knowledge object, moving towards linked metadata, and finally persistent identifiers. So before I go too much further, I just want to talk a little bit about computable phenotypes and why we think this is important, and particularly why we think that these should be represented as fair digital objects. So for the purposes of this presentation, we can understand a computable phenotype as a machine interpretable or machine actionable method of classifying individuals based on secondary use of data from their electronic health records. So this is not data that's been collected for any purpose other than clinical care, billing, administrative work. And computable phenotypes have lots of different applications in both clinical research and in clinical care. For the example that we're currently working to model, this is a computable phenotype that was developed for cohort identification for a clinical trial, but other aspects, other research uses could include powering comparative effectiveness studies. Computable phenotypes can be used to augment disease registries. And on the clinical care side, they power risk prediction models, clinical decision support tools, and things like that. So in short, when you're looking at a computable phenotype of the type that we're working with, you have an identified population of people. You have an algorithm that runs over data that's stored in an electronic health record, and a lot of computable phenotypes are basically binary, so they will classify patients as either having or not having the condition of interest based on the phenotype itself. Increasingly, with machine learning and with natural language processing being added into these phenotypes, we're starting to see that they can actually stratify patients based on levels of risk for conditions. So some that we've seen include predicting risk for risky alcohol behavior, subphenotyping of diseases, so identifying different classes of disease within a large disease like depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. There's a lot of reasons that we think that computable biomedical knowledge in general and computable phenotypes more specifically should be fair. First and foremost, a lack of reusability of these sorts of artifacts really is a barrier to continuing science moving forward. So if you can't reuse some of these algorithms or things that have been developed, you're reduplicating cost, you're reduplicating effort and resources. If these phenotypes can be reused, it also helps with reproducibility for published research results. The last two items are particularly relevant for healthcare. So we feel that being able to reuse phenotypes may address what has been referred to as a lack of clinically equivalent populations. And basically what this means is that if you have one study that has defined something like type 2 diabetes in a certain way and another study that has defined it in a different way, you don't necessarily have populations that can be compared to test the equivalence of those two studies. We're also very concerned with what's being called an advanced use digital divide. So what this means, particularly in the context of the United States healthcare system, which it has been acknowledged is neither a system nor does it generally provide healthcare. You have systems, including those at academic medical centers, that have informatics departments, that have a lot of people that know about algorithms and know how to implement them. But increasingly in rural centers or in places that don't have access to an academic medical center, where you don't have that type of expertise to develop these things in-house, Unless there's something that can be reused within your context, you're at a disadvantage compared to other systems. Most importantly, this means that patients aren't receiving potentially the care that they need, nor do they have access to clinical trials. We are really interested with these computable phenotypes and with computable biomedical knowledge more broadly in the aspect of moving knowledge into practice. So what you see on the screen here is a representation of a learning cycle, which is the foundation of a learning health system, which is basically a system that can increasingly learn from itself based on the data that it generates to improve its own operations and ideally how they're providing care in human health. So there's 3 different workflows. There's a practice to data flow, a data to knowledge flow, and then a knowledge to practice flow. And our hope is that our work would implement the knowledge to practice workflow. So the example that we've chosen, the computable phenotype that we're trying to package as a knowledge object, was not selected at random. This is a computable phenotype for nephrotic syndrome, and we selected it for several reasons. First off, the authors have already gone to a good deal of trouble to make this publicly available. So they have a GitHub site where they've posted 3 different modules, the classifier, the validator, and then a statistical program that runs along with this. The code is really well documented. It's standards-based, so the phenotype itself derives from International Classification of Disease codes and also uses a common data model, which helps with the problem that a lot of health systems just don't use the same way to model their data. Having said that, unless you're really good with SQL, it's very difficult for a user to approach this GitHub site and figure out what to do with this computable phenotype. And we found that even with the well-documented code, we had issues trying to understand how we could actually operationalize this. So what we're trying to do, different to what we've done before, is take the original SQL classifier and package multiple implementations of this within one knowledge object. So our hope is that what this would do is give end users of lots of different kinds who might use the phenotype for lots of different purposes with varying levels of technical expertise access to this knowledge. We're also trying to make the metadata a bit more robust. So I have a talk in the upcoming session about our work to transform our current, sometimes very sparse metadata records into linked metadata. So this example, we're working to link out in a couple of different ways. So linking out to citations, linking out to the common data model, and then at the bottom, you see our service specification, our deployment specification, and then links to the various types of payload for this knowledge object. So in summary, we do believe that computable phenotypes can be packaged as knowledge objects containing unique identifier, metadata, and then deployment specifications. They're very different to the types of knowledge that this lab has previously worked with. So this is challenging our understanding of how we actually develop knowledge as a service and how this can be implemented. Some of the questions that we're looking at is what's actually going to be within the boundaries of this computable phenotype knowledge object. Where and how do we integrate related content? So for example, where do we integrate the version of the common data model that was used? How can we provide access to a synthetic data set so that people could actually work with this and see if it's something that would be useful for their work? In terms of what and how to package core knowledge, what is that? Is that just the classifier? Do we have the validation object as a component of the knowledge object? And what do we do about the statistical package? And probably the most important part from my aspect is really learning about what we need to do to optimize the extensibility and build the core ecosystem around this knowledge. And this includes investigating designated communities, people who might be using this for various purposes, understanding what their needs are, and how we can build the knowledge object out to make it more robust and to meet their needs. That's what I have this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your really nice talk, Marisa. The floor is open for questions, please.
Thank you. It was very interesting to look at the sort of the objects that you're thinking about. I was interested in to know a little bit like the most of the electronic health record system, at least in the US that I know of, are commercial, like big proprietary system. I mean, how does that impact into this idea of fair and open system that you're thinking about?
Putting my librarian hat back on, I would say that because the primary electronic health record systems in the United States are commercial, that makes this work even more important. So the two primary providers of electronic health records in the United States right now are Epic and Cerner. Epic in particular has options for people to be able to develop third-party applications. This links in with some recent provisions that have made health systems now have to share more data on demand to meet interoperability requirements that the government has set forward. So some of these vendors have actually established these third-party app. Epic calls theirs, I think, the Apple Orchard or something like that. But from my librarian perspective, that feeds back into the problem of this digital divide. So if you are developing apps for only one commercial system, where does that leave people that don't have access to that system? Whereas we think or we hope that with this knowledge object model that people will actually be able to extract the data that they need from electronic health systems and potentially use stuff outside of the walled gardens that these EHR vendors may be propagating. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Is there any other question? So, if there's no question, thanks a lot
Thank
for
you.
your talk. Looking forward to your next session. So with this, we can go to our next speaker. I invite Sara El-Gebali to talk about biospecimen and FDO work. Floor is yours.
Number three. The third one? Cool. All right. Thank you all so much. So my name is Sara El-Gebali. I'm a project leader at the SciLife Lab. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. You're not the only one. Okay. I'm a project leader at the SciLife Lab in Sweden. Okay. Thanks. And today I'll be presenting together with Rory Macneil from Erzsébet. So we will be talking about our vision for biospecimen and the FDO world.
Could you speak up a little bit?
Okay. Is this working at all? Okay. Right. So by biospecimen, what we're referring to here is any material that's taken from a biological entity, for either for testing, for research purposes, and that covers things like cell lines, tissues, organs, and so forth. So the very nature of these samples puts forward like some challenges, right? So these physical samples are sometimes lost, they are misplaced and hidden, or just otherwise unavailable in labs, but they could also be very, very rare or hard to get hold of to start with. So, and most often the physical sample itself is destroyed during the process of testing or research, and some samples have particular challenges related to them, like regulatory issues, like genetic material from people, and we're seeing a lot more a boom in the scientific collections. They're becoming a lot bigger. They're becoming on par with big data, and that's thanks to new technologies, things like single-cell omics. It's just becoming a lot harder to handle these collections in that sense. And despite of these challenges, there's a clear need for it's a clear role that they play in basic scientific research. And because of this, samples really need our attention. They are seen a lot more often as research outputs in their own right. And that means that they need our attention for digitization and verification. And the physical sample digitization has like an enormous promise in terms of offering reuse for current sample-based data, and that allows for meta-analysis of multiple data sets. It also promotes interdisciplinary research, which is a lot more common than you think. And it also helps us avoid duplication of efforts, especially when you think about that the samples are destroyed or not even available anymore. So as a way to preserve these samples and give them an extended shelf life, digitization comes into the picture. And that also allows them to have the flexibility to move beyond the institutional boundaries, to bypass a lot of these issues that we see in wet lab research or in common basic scientific research. So some things that are common scenarios that we see is that the samples, they have local names, they change names as they change hands and as they go through multiple processes. And the most common situation is the samples are lost when that person moves away. So digitization offers the solutions to these common issues, but it also holds the most important, one of the most important things here is to support open science. So digitization and verification support open science and challenge this culture of a strong sense of ownership over things, like one sole person who holds all of that information that is practically lost when that person is moved away. And we've seen this happen all the time. So how do you make this and preserve the value of the samples? And we believe that the FDO model or the FDO architecture provides biospecimen with these necessary elements to achieve digitization and verification goals. So it allows them to reach their full potential. And that way it also allows them to link to data sets, to workflows, to people, to organizations, and any other digital information. So for biosamples to be classified as or go into the FDO architecture, they require identification by a globally unique, persistent, resolvable identifier, and they also need metadata records. And metadata requires, in turn, e-infrastructures, and that's which oftentimes either needs to improve or to be put in place to start with to allow for metadata acquisition. So these e-infrastructures also need to be user-friendly and embedded in how the researchers work, otherwise there will be no take-up or uptake and adoption. But when we talk about metadata, it's not just about the technology, it's about the community. Community plays a big role. So community needs to get together, identify the key descriptors that play a really important role and by key descriptors, I mean the minimal set of attributes that are required for comprehension, they're required for machine actionability, and the deployment of FDO models for biospecimen. So at the SciLife Lab, we have a very complex situation here, and most typical scenario is that we have a user that sends in a sample to a platform or multiple platform units under platforms, and basically the sample is analyzed in so many different ways, creating a ton of different data. So that sent us into into a quest of having to find the infrastructure and the metadata that support to support this process, essentially. So we have, just to give you an idea, we have 10 platforms, and that's like 40 units, and they support around 1,400 researchers a year. So the sample comes in, goes through multiple processes, and it can be lost. It can get different namings, and as it goes from one unit to another, one process to another. So what we set out to do is to identify a system that helps us to deal with that and couple the samples with the research outputs, and also identify the reporting guidelines. And these are, again, the key descriptors that our community here involved at the SciLife Lab level sees as relevant and important descriptors that must be reported on to contextualize and describe the biospecimen. And this is as an initial phase for the process of development of models, of formats, and to facilitate data exchange. So as a result to this, we came up with a tiered approach here. So you can see core descriptors, recommended descriptors, and additional info. Core descriptors here is the set of descriptors that we can advise the researchers to collect early on. And that includes all the information they need from the infrastructures. And we really want to ensure that the researchers have everything they need, the right set of information from the start to enable them to submit to repositories down the line. Because what happens is that they send the sample, they get the experiment done, 3 to 5 years later they submit somewhere and they realize they don't have all the information needed. So while coming up with this set of attributes, we compared a handful of repositories and how samples were described in them. And this to make sure that there's data portability between our systems and the endpoints and repositories. So here, the core descriptors, they outline everything needed for basic understanding and for discoverability, for interoperability. Then we have the recommended, which is the set of based on community standards. And this is very specific to use cases, to data types, to experiments, and we work with the researchers and infrastructures on one-to-one basis to figure this out and put in place. And then we have the additional one. Oh, sorry, so I'm gonna rush through it. So we've got additional one, which is extra information. So, but metadata here is the cornerstone of the FAIR principles, and together with the PIDs, they're important enablers for digital transformation. And that's why we teamed up with the IGSN, and which provide a unique persistent identifier for material samples in domain agnostic fashion. And IGSN enables the samples to be linked, found on the web, and they portray parent-children relationships. And so recent efforts by IGSN EV and partnership with DataCite is to support other disciplines in using persistent identifiers on a technical and community level. So on a technical level, to transition the IGSN infrastructure under the DataCite DOI services, and on a community level by scaling up community engagement to ensure long-term sustainability and establishing communities of practice. So we are here to actually call on the FDO community to build this community of practice specifically focused on biospecimen samples. And as I mentioned earlier, metadata requires e-infrastructures. Yeah, sorry, if you're interested, just get in touch with Rory for community work. And as mentioned, we require e-infrastructure for creation and acquisition, so ELN in that comes into the right, slots in the right place, that is embedded in the researcher workflows. And I'm gonna hand it over to Rory for the last minute to give more details. Sorry.
Hi everyone, I'll be brief. Thank you, Sara. So yes, this is going to the last minute is going to look at this from the e-infrastructure perspective. So RSpace, I guess it's cut off a bit, but it's a digital research platform which started out as an electronic lab notebook. The three core elements are an electronic lab notebook, a sample management system, which is relevant to this discussion, and a powerful set of APIs. And you can see from this graphic that this is all about data, not about metadata. And so the whole concept is to connect connectivity with other kinds of data that people are use in research, whether it's data storage, whether it's specialist tools like Protocols IO, or a colony management system, or equipment scheduling, as well as research data management tools, things like data management plans, and then repositories. So that's the platform, if you will. Whoops. Sorry. Whoops. There we go. So we are doing two things to facilitate making this an infrastructure which better supports fair data objects. The first is, as Sara alluded, we're working with DataCite to incorporate IGSNs into relationships with sample data in our space, which is shown here, and that's actually coming out in January, so it's quite imminent. I believe we're going to be one of the first, if not the first, e-infrastructure to really do something with the new IGSN DataCite partnership, which is exciting. And the second is we're also working on incorporating ontologies in association with all kinds of data sets in our space. And we're working with various ways to do this, but one way in which we're doing it is working with Nick Garabedian and his group at KIT, which has built kind of an ontology tool to facilitate, that's actually intended to be used in conjunction with other e-infrastructures like electronic lab notebooks. And I encourage you to see Nick's poster. He's got a poster during the poster session. So the grand vision, if you will, is to replicate with metadata, in particular starting out with PIDs and ontologies, the kind of connectivity and support for workflows and ecosystems which we have with data, to do the same thing with metadata. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara and Rory. Since we are a little bit tight in the schedule, there's a place for one small question. If somebody on the floor have a small question to ask. Yes, please, come forward.
I ask out of ignorance here, but are there good ontologies for biosamples at this point? You talk about being able to do it. What exactly are you doing, like specifically? Are there good ontologies at this point that have been developed or not? Yes.
Please use speaker.
So in life sciences, there are ontologies for that. NCI1 is, for instance, one of the. We have also that covers different types of data. So we have Cellosaurus or cell line. So we have multiple ontologies covering different aspects. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah. Obviously, incorporating an ontology into another tool, that's a separate issue. So and Nick's tool is actually about building new ontologies as well. So yes, there are existing ontologies. Nick is helping people build new ontologies, and then there's the issue of how do you incorporate it into the infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Sara and Rory again. And with this, we come to our next talk. I invite Olav ten Bosch to talk about fair digital object in official statistics.
Before. Good morning, my name is Olav ten Bosch from Statistics Netherlands for the Dutch speaking at CBS in Nederland. I'm feeling a bit as an outsider, being from statistics office. I'm probably the only one from the world. I didn't see any of my fellow colleagues from other offices, but I did some thinking together with a colleague from Eurostat, the European Statistical Office, of what FDOs could mean for official statistics, and I want to take you on a quick journey on that.
We'll talk about what is official statistics anyway. Maybe you don't know, and it's, well, something. What are digital objects in official statistics? How fair is this all, actually? And a little wrap-up. So, start simple. This is our homepage 2 weeks ago. And it displays a lot of fancy pictures, and we make figures about society, economy, environment, everything in the Netherlands. Actually, we have one institute doing it all, and we try to do it in a way, and that's we don't send too many questionnaires to people because people don't like it, or to enterprises. So we get any data source that we can get, we get it, and we are allowed to do that. There's a law for that. And we have a lot of microdata, and then we make the statistics on the Netherlands. You can find the aggregated data on our website, and these are all stories about it. If you dive a little bit deeper from the homepage and you click, for instance, on one of the two buttons, you see a dashboard. The dashboard is about demography. There's actually a population counter. It's an estimate of the actual now casting number of people in the Netherlands. Of course, it's not correct, it's an estimate, and that holds for actually for every figure on the website. And on the right you see a thematic article on, yeah, let's say a very hot topic right now, and that's inflation. We all feel it, and there's a big discussion about it. And it explains how we measure it, and also what the cause of the big inflation is right now. That a lot to do with energy, of course, you know. So this is all high-level content on our website, and if you click deeper, then you go into more data, to a data level. On the left side, you have the demography. You end up in a slice. There's a pre-selected slice of data in our statistical database, which is called Statline. So these are the population key figures. It's a bit too small, probably, but you can look back on the demographic figures for multiple years. And on the right, you end up in a table about, yeah, what's it called? A consumer price index. And that's our statistical term for inflation. It's completely different. And it's interesting to see because there are different vocabularies around. And we try to have on the higher level speak about inflation. People know that. And in the detailed level, we have the statistical terminology. And it also says that 2015 is 100. Well, normal people would probably not understand, but we say in 2015 it was 100, and then we have kind of index. So if you dive deeper into the statistics, you have more probably complicated terms. So we have, in fact, a kind of a layered data architecture. You start on the high level, speaking the terminology of the public. There are news articles, thematic articles, visualizations, dashboards, and then we have selected data slices, and in beneath you end up in the statistical facts, I would say, or I should have said statistical estimates, but okay, for this, statistical facts. Okay, what is official statistics? Official statistics, actually we are not the only statistical office. Every country has one or multiple, and in the European Union we have the EU European statistical system. We all deliver our aggregated data to Eurostat, and they provide European statistics, harmonized statistics. And we also deliver data to many international organizations like the UN, like the OECD, and they also have their statistical database on their specific subject. And this all we call official statistics because it's all generated and measured by governmental organizations. Okay, back to us. In the layered data architecture, so I questioned myself what would be fair digital objects in our output. And I thought, okay, you can identify them on multiple levels. The news articles itself are a digital object. They have metadata, like when, by whom, and maybe versioning, whatever. The thematic pages and also the charts are all digital objects. The selected data slices are, the statistical facts are, and the metadata is. And the metadata, I put it here on the border of the table. It's actually the borders, the metadata about the cell in the table. So we can identify multiple levels of digital objects, was my thinking. At the lowest level, we have a statistical database. It's freely accessible by everyone. It has a lot of, if you measure it, 2.4 billion statistical facts, with search, select, filter, and download, an API, OData, by the way, and some convenience packages for data scientists to access this from R and Python. It's quite popular, but it's also very dedicated for our office. And talking about standardization, I worked for many years also in international context, and a lot of statistical offices have something like that, and they're all very proud of it, but it's all different. And that's not good. So this is a table from Eurostat, another layout, but the concepts are the same. And with this slide, I want to make clear that with metadata in our discipline, we have access to 2 types. And it's very, very important for statistics. We have the structural metadata, that's like the codes and the dimensions, so the borders of the table, and actually this is a 4-dimensional table. We have age, sex, a classification of educational, an international harmonized classification, and a geo. There are 2 countries, Austria and Netherlands here. So this we call the structural metadata. And we have been working in this area for 100 years, actually, as Statistics Netherlands, but there are many years of standardization already. So what we want in the statistics is to standardize all the structural metadata as much as possible. And it's not easy. But there's also another type of metadata, and I think that's more called reference metadata, descriptive metadata. There's also a standard for that. And that's a single integrated metadata standard. It's single because there were 2 standards before which merged, and this is more a descriptive metadata, but it's very important. It's about the accuracy and the timeliness, even costs, but that maybe release policy. It's everything about this data set. So the point is that in our world, the structural metadata, but also the other metadata, was very important to standardize, because otherwise you cannot compare all the data across countries. And we have this concept of metadata registries. There are 4 of them here, from the global community, Eurostat, IMF, the organizations, and UNICEF. Internationally harmonized metadata. It took years. And I was thinking about this yesterday when there was the first session about fair digital object frameworks, and also some thinking about registries. I think, okay, if there's to be later a general concept of registries that it's fair digital object registries, it should somehow relate to this. Would be an ideal thing to think about. So in this we have metadata, versioning, ownership. You can access also the metadata as a data. So there's an API. Okay, look into our own output and put it in one layered picture. So there are digital objects, news, chart, thematic, metadata, statistical facts. Actually, there's a layer below. You can't see it from the outside, but we also have our microdata accessible for scientific use under strict conditions. And if you look at the standards being used right now, it's actually a mixture of standards. I can name them. They were on many slides already, so you know them. Probably you don't know the SDMX, you don't know the JSON stat, and these are designed for statistics. And I will be happy to think about because we want statistics accessible also by other communities, to interface this in a more generic world. On the right, I've put there some linked data standards. So you're with Eurostat and with standards, we're moving into linked data. But I think the mix of standards is actually not the thing you want. There are 2 slides about linked data. So Eurostat does it on the publication office, EU vocabularies, and we do this on that side. And the advantage is, of course, that it helps linkability of official statistics with other communities. Okay. I'm in the end, just a conclusion. I think that the FAIR principles are a very good vehicle to further improve also our output. And the thing is that openness is not enough. You should actually have a fair glass on every layer. The mix of standards is actually something I'm not so happy with, but the world is not ideal. And to move to semantic interoperability is a good thing. So if you have ideas, I will be happy to know them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olav, for demystifying what is official statistics. And the floor is open for a question, please.
Yes, thank you for your talk. Our institute performs the agricultural census, and so that's very similar in the sense that you have a big load of structured data over multiple years. And I'm wondering how you look at, because for samples it's very clear, right? One sample equals one object, one digital object. But for this long-term, long-range data, how do you divide it into objects? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, right now the time dimension is a dimension in our data. And it is always there. There are hardly any output without a time dimension, because statistics is always per year, per quarter, per 2 years. So that's not different for agricultural data. To look at it from a digital object, fair digital object perspective, we are just at the beginning actually, and I think this is more like an outside view, because I try to have both, but in the end I'm also inside. And inside we manage everything with a time dimension, let's say, and you can create per time. But there are multiple time dimensions actually. Also, you have an estimate, and an estimate can have about a period, and it can be refined with new data. So the time dimension is actually a very complicated thing in statistics. I don't know if it answered, but.
Thank you for the talk. It was interesting. So about the mix of standards. So in the biodiversity domain and what we do with all the museum specimen, also similar in the biomedical, we have the same issue. So one thing we've been trying to do is that we gave up on coming up with one standards to fix everything. It just creates another thing. So we've been spending a lot of time on the mapping. So for example, I'll give you a very simple example. So in one data set, somebody says organization, and in another data set, somebody says institutions. Just two different vocabularies, but they're probably meaning the same thing. So we try to kind of give them the freedom to do their thing, but in our sort of data ingestion mapping, we try to reconcile that. But then we force a unique identifier for that element. So at least on that level, there's some coherency. But when it gets to the sort of the data providers, they kind of do what they want. So that's something, I don't know if you have any ideas about mapping from your domain. That would be interesting.
Absolutely. In the structural metadata, you have the classifications, and it looks so simple. If you in the world would have the same classification of economic activity, for instance, the NACE it's called, then we could make statistics in all the countries and regions on this economic activity. But in fact, they're all local differences. And this has an historic reason, of course, because not everything is covered in every country and every culture. So there are a lot of variants, and all these variants have to be managed. And what we now do as good as possible is create mappings between all the classifications. So this is very structured, of course, but it could also be in a loosely coupled world, I would say. So what I presented here is a very ideal picture. In reality, the thing that I would, so like these registries, they can have these mappings, but we also do now experiment with these mappings in linked data, because it's not only, we don't, in the end, official statistics is not only about producing official statistics and then we all agree in official statistics, it's about the use by other communities. So by producing these mappings as linked data, we hope that it is easier to do exactly as you said, actually, to let the world map to official statistics and into their world. And if you can do that better, then please let us know. So the same applies to R.
Thank you very much, Olav. With that, we can go to our next talk. Okay, go ahead, please. And we will hear about taxonomic treatment as an open, fair digital object.
Yeah, this one. Yeah, this one. Can you? Okay. Yeah, thank you. So my name is Lyubomir Penev, and I will hold this presentation on behalf of Platzi. And Platzi is a Switzerland-based organization which extracts and liberates data about biodiversity from publications and expose these data into a common infrastructure so that they can be reused. So in this presentation, I will try to show that the long way to the fair data object as we understand it today in biology, and especially in the biodiversity realm, actually started more than 270 years ago with the fundamental work of Carl Linnaeus' Systema Naturae. Why is so? It is because Linnaeus invented the most important and the first ever life science identifiers. This is the Latin binomen for biological species. You see here his treatment of the genus Homo, of the humans, and he named the human as Homo sapiens and even put one more species of Homo, Homo americanus, which according to Linnaeus is Rufus, Holericus, and Rectus. Okay, so we have already the first identifier. We have the provenance of that identifier, which means the name of the author of that name is normally put after the name itself. So it should read Homo sapiens Linnaeus. And we also add the year of the introduction of that identifier, in this case 1758. So we have the identifier, we have the provenance, we have the publication record. What happened after that? Linnaeus also invented not only the identifier, but he also invented we can call this the metadata, probably, or the information around biological species in the so-called taxonomic treatment. You see here the treatment of Apus mellifera. This is the honeybee. And Linnaeus, it contains the name of Apus mellifera, then some synonyms here, some synonyms of previously used names for the same species, the morphological description below, then some data on the distribution and biology and ecology of this species. So the taxonomic treatment is actually a section of a publication, of a published work, which contains data about biological species. And after Linnaeus, many authors published on this and many other species, and they formulated their own treatments about that species, amending them with more data about various things, which means that one species can have more than one treatment, and some popular species may have hundreds, maybe thousands of taxonomic treatments over all these 200-something years. Okay. So the source of the treatment, of the original treatment, in the past has been identified by the article metadata, which means who published it, in which journal, which volume, which pages, and so on. Now we can identify it with the digital object identifier. This is a DOI, the DOI of Systema Naturae, which has been assigned retrospectively to that work by the Biodiversity Heritage Library. So we have the identifier, we have the links to the source of it. So, so we have here already what I actually said, the identifier, the treatment, and the link to the source. And then if we extract this from the paper, from the scanned paper, or from the digitally born PDF, and semantically enhance that extraction with which sections means what, then we have a very rich environment. We have a perfect candidate for a fair data object. Why? Because you can see here that all extracted treatment, this is the main work of Platzi, are put together in a biodiversity literature repository based at Zenodo. And all those treatment after extraction, even from very old papers like that of Linnaeus, are being enriched with a lot of additional metadata and links to external vocabularies, ontologies, and so on. This means that even the oldest treatments are enhanced retrospectively with a lot of semantics, a lot of additional links about that treatment. And this really makes the treatment findable, accessible, fair in general, because all these elements which we discuss now for a fair data object are actually present in the treatments when it is already enhanced and put in Zenodo. We also managed to convince DataCite to introduce a special subtype for taxonomic treatments in the infrastructure, because you know that Zenodo used DataCite DOIs. We also add custom keywords to that treatments, and all these custom keywords are actually identified with resolvable identifiers to vocabularies or ontologies. For example, the status of that treatment, which means new species, this is the treatment which describes a new species, is linked to the Darwin core term from the Darwin core ontology. Also, all those treatments are actually machine readable because they are exported in JSON and in XML. And thanks to that, all citations they contain, like treatment can include, let's say, references to images of that species, or to tables with some morphological data, or to other publications, like previously published names. So in the XML, you can see that all those links are embedded in the enriched XML of that treatment. So this turns the treatments into machine readable data elements. What happens after? Here is Pensoft, which I represent here at the conference. This is a publisher based in Bulgaria, Sofia. Well, Platzi extract treatments from published literature, mostly from PDFs. We publish the new publication, new articles in semantically enriched XML, and XML is being tagged and enriched before publication, so that when the article is published, Platzi automatically takes this information and put it into their infrastructure. After that, what happens? So the newly published treatments and the historical treatments are coming together in the same format, so that they can be reused together. Imagine the treatment of Linnaeus and treatments of new species published, let's say, yesterday. It happens automatically. And at the very end, all these treatments are converted to RDF and put together in the Open BioDiff Biodiversity Knowledge Graph. Open BioDiff is actually a triple store, a graph database, which use a common ontology, and it puts together the linked open data extracted from all those treatments. Again, historical, legacy treatments, and those which are published every day. Treatments are not just put somewhere for our joy, they are reused quite a lot. For example, on GBIF, Platzi export all published treatments and link those treatments to the species name of GBIF, which means that more than 400,000 treatments are already there, linked to the species names in GBIF, which means they enrich the content of GBIF tremendously. Also, one species can have more than one treatment, sometimes many more treatments, and all these treatments are linked to one and the same species name. So that was for me. Thank you for your attention. Probably the right title of the talk should be not that taxon treatment is a fair data object, but the perfect candidate for the fair data object. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to be perfectly on time. The floor is open for question. Any question? Yeah, please.
Hello, but can you talk a little bit about if the publication is not open access or if it's under paywall, like what happens with all these extractions?
Well, thanks to the Swiss legislation, treatments in Switzerland are considered data, not creative work, which means that they don't fall under the copyright protection. So Platzi do this legally. They are based in Switzerland. I'm not sure if you do this in Germany, how it will happen, but in Switzerland, this is possible. So this means that open access articles have no problem with that, of course. They are even motivated to expose their content more and more. And the subscription-based journals or copyrighted journals could simply, they also should be happy to have their information distributed and communicated to the audience. And again, in Switzerland, this is legal and possible.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And with that, we will come to our last speaker of this session. I would like to invite Anna Fouilloux, and she will talk about fair research object for realizing open science with reliance on EOSC project.
Yes, so thank you. So I will talk about a research object. I'm not sure this is really fair digital object. From what I heard yesterday, I didn't understand much, but we are trying. So I'm Anne, and I'm working with Federica. Sorry, I need to move this because I can't see the slide. And Elisa. So first, a bit of background on the Reliance project. So this is part of the European Open Science Cloud, and they are delivering 3 services. The first one is a data cube service. This is for accessing and discovering scalable structured data, so typically satellite observation, because this is what we are using in the earth science. Then there is a research object service, RoHub, for aggregating all the research artifacts we are creating. So this is this one. I will come back to it later. And then there is a text mining service. This is machine-readable metadata extraction. And they are discovering metadata from the content of the research object. And they are trying then to make, for instance, collaborations fair. So we can find other research objects of interest or other researchers working on the same kind of research. So in this Reliance project, I'm part of a community. I'm part of the climate change community, and I'm working on Earth system modeling. And Federica is part of the sea monitoring community, and Elisa is part of the geohazard. So we are just users of research objects. So at the beginning of the project, we tried to analyze how we worked and how we can change our daily practices to be more open and to use this fair digital object. So we realized that we are using remote sensing data, so very large amount of data, and they are usually remote, and in situ observation. In terms of software and method, it's a bit of a mess. We are using different kind of software, commercial, open source, ad hoc, and created by others. In terms of computing facilities, we can go from the small laptop to very large infrastructure. So for running Earth system models, we are running on the biggest high-performance computers. And for disseminating results and data management, we were writing papers, if we can, and we were going to conferences and creating slides. And I have to say, I will show you, I found it was very, very hard for me to create slides when we are using digital objects. I found, oh, this is what I was doing, but it's odd. And I will show you why. So we had to find a motivation for using fair digital object or research object and open science. So the first motivation is to search, to find and access resources that are not only papers. Because if I take a paper, that's great, but I need to write the methods, and I spend a lot of time. So for instance, if I can find a Jupyter notebook, and it shows how I can access the data I'm interested in, I save a lot of time. But then, this is where reproducibility and reuse matter to me. Because if I find a Jupyter notebook, that's great, but most of them are unusable. I cannot understand what is in the content, and in addition to that, it doesn't run. So this is very important, and this is a motivation. And the last one is to facilitate publication and citation. Because if I work along the way, and I aggregate all the resources while I'm working, when I will publish, I will just have to add a digital object identifier. And the just is not the just, but I only realize later. So this is what we do in practice, and this is very hard to show like live. But we have at the central, this is at the bottom, the research object, RoHub. And at the beginning, what we do, we are sharing while doing. So it means the research object will evolve, because at the beginning, we only have IDs of what we want to do. And then we have data, and we need to share the data. And sometimes we get data, and then we remove data, and this is not the data we wanted to use, so it's changing. And then we also share the tools. And in the Reliance project, we are using two different kinds of tools. We are using EGI notebooks, so Jupyter notebooks, and we are using the Climate Science Workbench for Galaxy. It's a Galaxy portal. This is to run complex workflows. And then we also want to share paper, because we collaborate when we write papers. So this is what it looks like, a research object. So it's a bit static, and this is not how it is normally. So a research object will have a title, and this is very much what I would do when I write a data management plan. I have a title of my project, I have the main author, I have the collaborators, I have a short description, and maybe one or two catchy images, and to explain what it will be about. Then it will have some keywords, and the keywords, I realize I don't have to put a lot of keywords, because we have this text mining service. And many of the interesting keywords I never thought about will be extracted automatically, and this is much better for interdisciplinary reuse. It can be cited. It has a persistent identifier. It's not a digital object identifier, because it's a live research object, because research is live. I will change, I will add content, and I will remove content. So we also found out it's very important to structure the research object so we can reuse it, especially when it's not my own research object. So this is why we asked to have, like in the content part, you can see this is organized. We have like a biblio folder. So here this one is an executable research object. So if this is a bibliographical research object, we will have only a biblio folder. And here I can put papers, but I can also put videos, I can put anything, blogs, tweets, whatever I want, and can be useful for reuse. Then we have an input folder, because this is an executable research object, so it has some input. If this is a data-centric research object, it mostly have input, raw data, and in and output. And here, for the input data, what is very important for reuse is to be able to associate the data with some tools to be able to reuse the data. So for instance, if I click on the small cube, it will show you what tools you can use for showing or analyzing the data. So for instance, here it says you can use the Adam platform, and will pop up the Adam platform service, and you can visualize exactly the same data I have used for my analysis. And you can also explore the data set. So you can go and change the dates, you can change the geographical area, so you can already explore what I'm using. And this is the same for the tools. Oh, so I can skip this one. This is the same for the tools. So we have a tool folder, so you can identify what I'm using for my data analysis. And again, when you click here, and you see this is a small link icon, and it means this is an external resource, so it's not internal to the research object. It's typically on GitHub, because this is where we store the Jupyter notebook. And it says you can open it in the EGI notebook. And when you open it, you have what is on the right-hand side. And you can re-execute it. You can modify it. And you can create your own research object from the existing one. So you can fork. You see on the right-hand side at the top, you can fork the research object. You can add your content. You can remove some of the content. And it's still shareable. It has always a persistent identifier. It's still not a digital object identifier because it's still live. Okay, you can skip this one. So this is what it looks like when we try to share as much as we can. One thing we realize is when we share, we have some kind of responsibility of what we share. So we want to be fair, fundable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, but we also want to care. So we found that the care principles are useful because we had issues. So see here, this is an example where poachers used a science paper to target newly discovered species, and they don't have good intention. So you cannot share everything, and we probably need to have some kind of protocol where how you can access maybe the data. So the care principles, which are about collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, this is not machine readable as far as I know, and we have to go back to people, and we have to teach, or we have to learn researchers on how and what we can share. And this is where we think community of practice will play a big role. So for us, this is really important that we organize at a community level, and we agree on what and how to share. And this is what we are trying to do with this environmental data science book. So this is an initiative led by Alejandra Coca-Castro. It's part of the Alan Turing Institute. And what we are trying to do is, when you share, if you want to reuse, you need to organize your research. I mean, you don't only share like a Jupyter notebook with all your mess. It needs to be well organized, and you need, if you organize it well, it can be reused, and it also you can reuse it. So for instance, we try to agree on what kind of best practices for writing a Jupyter notebook, to have a title, some tags, some context, to separate the data access from the analysis. So you can use different data, or you can use a different analysis. So this is the kind of things we are trying to do. We have a collaborative review process, both a bit like scientific, this is very light, and technical on how to organize the data. And this is to improve the best practices, so to improve as a community. So we organize discussion on how and what is a research object, and tutorial, etc. So we need to engage with the community. So this is an example where we have issues now when we are sharing. We also want to share the computational environment. And this is very important for us to be able to rerun with all the packages we are using, and we don't have like a standard package. And this is my conclusion. So I'm fully convinced this is very important to use fair digital object. I'm not sure what I'm using now is a fair digital object, or I'm pretty sure it's not yet a fair digital object, but we are trying. What is important for us is to have user-friendly services to handle fair digital object or research object, and in human readable manner. Because the research and where we want to advance the state of the art is done by researcher, so by human. So we also need to be part of the loop, and not only for machine. We also need to have the compute and storage, so what you call infrastructure, to make research object live, or fair digital object live, and not only a static object you publish at the very end, because we need to be able to execute, and we need to be able to try it, and we need to build new research out of it. And finally, we need a framework to exchange, collaborate, get feedback, and to grow as a community. So we think that community of practice are very important. And that's it.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. Any question on the floor?
Yes, thank you for your talk. I have a question on the R, so the reusability. Do you archive any metadata records on data that is deleted or changed? So if someone reuses the data and then it vanishes, do you still do you have a chance to track this? Or
yeah, so I didn't. Maybe I don't can go back oops, to like here. Yeah, so when we have like data here, this one will have data. Sorry. Yeah. So what this is where a community of practice are very important, because here we are saying if we remove something, first of all you have the annotation in the research object, but also we make a snapshot of the research object, and we can get a digital object identifier for the research object with a data that is still there, and then we will delete it for the next stage. So it's a bit like in for software when you do releases of your software. Here we do releases of the research object. So to say, okay, this is what we had. It was a milestone. It was important, but now we are moving on to something else.
Any other question? So then I will thank you once more. And with this, we will come to the end of this session. Thank you very much for your participation. Nice continuation of the conference. Thank you.